Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this webinar hosted by the Institute for Human Ecology here at the Catholic University of America. Our topic this afternoon is the common good and the modern nation state. My name is Father Aquinas Guilbeau. I'm the University Chaplain and Director of Campus Ministry at Catholic University, and also Vice President for Ministry and Mission. Our special guest this afternoon is Professor Brad Lewis. Professor Lewis is an Associate Professor of Philosophy here in the School of Philosophy at Catholic University, and currently he's a fellow at the Stockdale Center at the U.S. Naval Academy. And both Professor Lewis and I, in addition to being both on the campus of Catholic University, are also media fellows for the Institute for Human Ecology, our host this afternoon. Just in terms of this afternoon's format, Professor Lewis will begin with a presentation on our topic, the common good and the modern nation state, and I'll follow up with a few questions, and he and I will have a brief discussion, and then we'll open the floor to questions from everybody joining in this afternoon. And for your questions, feel free to type those in the chat, and those will be curated, and the ones we can get to we'll present to Professor Lewis for his responses. So again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Without further ado, Professor Brad Lewis on the common good and the modern nation state.
Thanks very much, Father, and thanks to the Institute. When they asked me to participate in this program, they asked that I talk about the research for a book that I'm working on. So that's where this is coming from, and that the kind of provisional title for the book is The Common Good and the Modern State. And so just to start up with a few remarks, the term common good, which is all over the place now, it's become kind of a hot topic. It's used a lot, often in a way that's quite vague, to the point where sometimes people have expressed a real skepticism about the utility of it, that it's a kind of vague, even meaningless term, a kind of cliche. I mean, after all, right, who's against the common good, right? Nobody runs for office by saying, vote for me, and I'll work for my own benefit and that of my friends, and I'll ignore the rest of you, right? I mean, nobody actually does that. When it is controversial, it's sometimes because it's taken to imply kind of overreach. So there was a kind of famous episode about 15 or 20 years ago when then Senator Hillary Clinton, maybe 15 years ago, gave a speech in which she was talking about tax hikes that were being proposed, and said, we're going to take things from you for the common good. And there was a kind of firestorm immediately on blogs and everywhere else, where people are saying, you see, common good, communism, that's what it means. So there are these problems, and often, the question is, what does it mean when it's used? Does it mean anything more specific than that? The Roman Catholic Church, in magisterial teachings, statements, magisterial documents on Catholic social teaching, has been employing a kind of formulation about the common good at the kind of highest level, the encyclical level, at least since 1961, and John the 23rd's encyclical Mater et Magistra, but most importantly in Gaudium et Spes, the Second Vatican Council's pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world. And that formulation, I think, is increasingly well known. It's also in the Catechism, section 1906 of the Catechism, and it says that the common good is the sum total of conditions on the basis of which individuals and groups can more fully and easily achieve their fulfillment or their perfection. And that formulation is now cited in every document that has to do with social teaching, politics, statements of bishops' conferences around the world, other kinds of Vatican documents. All the encyclicals that deal with social teaching since 1961 have either cited or quoted, usually quoted that statement, the Compendium of Social Teaching. So it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere now. But it's not without controversy. There are people who've criticized it, for example, from kind of two radically different perspectives. So on one side, people have sometimes said, well, it indicates a real thinning out of the notion of the common good that's at odds with a more classical view, because it seems to be largely instrumental by focusing on conditions. And so the question is, how can it really be a kind of final cause or a goal of political associations if it's simply instrumental? On the other hand, there are people who criticized it from the opposite side and said it sort of sets the bar too high because it focuses on the fulfillment or perfection of people, right? The conditions that that lead to that. And the term in all the Latin documents is perfectio, perfection. And so the objection here is, well, perfectio, that's a notion that's very controversial. People don't agree on what that means. So how can you have a notion of the common good that's predicated on a notion that's so controverted by people? So it's been sort of criticized from both sides. And so, there's an issue about where that formulation came from. And that's mainly, I want to talk about that formulation today because I think it's one of the more original aspects of the research that I've done on this. When I first started to look into the topic and I became interested in that formulation, I looked at commentaries on the Vatican II documents, especially, and histories of the council and so forth, hoping to find somebody who would explain precisely where that formulation came from. And I was sort of surprised that I didn't. I mean, there really wasn't much discussion of it at all. And so I started to look into it to try to figure out how it was arrived at. Because if you just look at it freshly, and if you're used to, for example, reading Aquinas and reading Aristotle, it might seem odd. I mean, it doesn't look exactly like you might expect. That notion of the common good, I mean, if you just think about that precise phrase, or a phrase that could be translated into English as common good, it's a very, very old one, standing for the purpose or the final cause of political association. So the first instance I can find of it in Western thinking, right, the literal phrase common good, is actually Herodotus, who uses that phrase once. And then it's used a number of times by Thucydides in his history of the Peloponnesian War, usually in speeches made by political figures. It's then used by Plato, but sparingly in that sort of clear way, really only once. But it becomes very important in Aristotle. It's a phrase that's used repeatedly in the Nicomachean Ethics and also in the Politics. And so that's how it makes it into medieval thought. Thomas Aquinas' great teacher, Albert the Great, commented and read Aristotle very carefully. And so he was very interested in that notion. And Thomas picked it up from there. So there's discussion of it in his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, but it also pops up all over the place in the Summa Theologiae and other works by St. Thomas. And it's used analogically by him to mean a number of different things. I mean, in some cases, by common good, he means God. In some places, he means human happiness. So the unity with God that human beings have in a subjective way. But sometimes he means it in a kind of natural way, what Aristotle means by happiness. And often it's used in a political context, the temporal common good, to indicate the final cause or the purpose of political association. So it's used in a lot of different ways in a lot of different contexts by Thomas, and often in a way that's similar to Aristotle's usage. So how does that relate then to this notion that we get from Catholic social teaching? And that's mainly what I want to talk about. And I want to talk about it really sort of in two ways. One, I want to say just a few things about the content of it, because I think one reason that that formulation is sometimes controversial is because it's taken out of context and not always interpreted with a lot of care. And then secondly, I want to say something about the history, about what I discovered about where it did come from as a very specific kind of formulation. So as far as the content goes, again, that formulation is that the common good comprises the sum total of conditions on the basis of which individuals and groups can more fully and easily achieve their fulfillment through their perfection. So one aspect of that is that it focuses on conditions. And that's the reason some people have been worried that it's a strictly instrumental definition, or that it can't really be a final cause. I don't think that's quite right. I mean, I think there are two things that are important about it when we think about conditions. And one of them was made clear by John Paul II, who in Centesimus Annus talked about that formulation and said something that was then included in the compendium on social teaching, which is that it's very important to say that it's a sum total of conditions, not utilities, or a sum total of personal goods. I mean, if that's what it were, then it would take on the cast of a kind of utilitarian notion of the common good. But that's not what it says. It says conditions. So you might say, well, why stop at conditions? And that actually is going to get us to the historical material that I want to talk about in a minute, because I think one of the main reasons it does focus on conditions has to do with the nature of the modern state as a political form very different from the small city-states that are the political context of Aristotle's thought. Athens in the 4th century BC had a total population of between 300,000 and 400,000. Most Greek cities were much smaller than that, or even the kind of political communities that you had in the 13th century when Thomas was writing. Medieval kingdoms, principalities, villages, and all kinds of politics was very complicated in its forms at that time, but very different from the modern state. And I'll say a little bit more about the character of the modern state later, but I think that's also relevant to why conditions are emphasized. So I'll come back to that. Second, it's important again to note that the last part of that formulation says that these conditions are aimed at the perfection, the perfectio, the fulfillment of persons. So while it focuses on conditions, those conditions are not an end in themselves. Those conditions are connected to some notion of perfection. Now, obviously, in the Catholic social teaching documents, it's a Catholic notion of perfection. But it's also important that modern states, empirically, are very pluralistic. They include a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of people who are not Roman Catholics. And so a set of conditions that's appropriate for the perfection as Catholics understand it could also be appropriate as a social state for other notions of perfection. And I think the empirical reality of pluralism is part of the reason that the formulation is what it is. Third, sometimes an objection to it is that it focuses on conditions and is therefore instrumental but also perhaps individualistic. But it's important that the formulation in Gaudium et Spes very clearly says individuals and groups. So it shouldn't be interpreted in a strictly individualistic way. I think among the groups that are obviously intended there are the family, the church, and sometimes there are a number of references to the Catechism, for example, to the common good of the church, but also to other kinds of associations, intermediate associations between the individual on the one hand, the family on the other, and the political community itself. So it's got a social aspect built into it. I think that's very important. Fourth, that formulation actually says that the common good comprises or includes the sum total of conditions. And the Latin verb that's used there, complector, I think matters, because to say that it's a sum total of conditions is not to exhaust the nature of the common good, right? The formulation says that it includes or comprises or contains those conditions, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily all that it is. And I think, again, if you think about the way Thomas talks about the common good, sometimes he means by it God, the separate common good of the whole cosmos, or the order of the universe, or the full flourishing of human beings as a kind of common good itself. So clearly this formulation is intended to describe an aspect of political reality, but that's a limited representation. I think that's important as well. And finally, a fifth thing about the content is, especially if you look at the discussion of the common good in Gaudium et Spes, section 74, I think the context in which it comes up is very important, because the whole discussion is of the social nature of human beings. There's a lot of discussion there of the virtues. There's more information on the content of the common good. And so I think sometimes when that formulation is simply pulled out and used free of that context, I mean, that's one reason people look at it with suspicion and are concerned about it. So I think it has to be read within that context. So I think those are things that are necessary to read it and to understand it in the right way. But now I come to the thing that I want to say about the history of the notion of the common good. As I say, when I first started to look into this, the things I was looking at, the commentary and so forth, really had very little to say about that. And I was really kind of surprised. And so I started looking at other kinds of commentaries, writings of popes that came before that, biographies of popes, histories of the council, trying to find clues for where it came up, and also the volumes of the acta of the council that contain speeches given by the participants, draft documents, the drafts of Gaudium et Spes that were sent to the floor of the council for debate by the council fathers, and then revised before the final text was approved in 1965. Some of those earlier drafts contain references and footnotes that are very interesting. But the real kind of clue that revealed what was going on was seeing that this formulation was popping up in other sources in the early 20th century and even in the late 19th century. So three in particular were important for me. One was the great Benedictine moralist Audin Lotan and medievalist. He actually wrote a textbook on moral thought called Morale Fondamentale, published in 1954. And he's got a discussion of the common good in there that includes a formulation that's very much like what's in the council documents. He just cites Aquinas for the definition, though, interestingly. There's also a great social economic thinker, a Jesuit, who was very influential on the first kind of documents in Catholic social teaching, the thinking of Leo XIII and of Pius XI, Heinrich Hesch, who was a famous Catholic economist associated with the Solidarist school of economic thinking. He wrote a sprawling, vast textbook on economics published between 1905 and 1923 called Lehrbuch der Nationalen Ökonomie. I don't know, kind of theoretical textbook on political economy, something like that. And in that book, he has a discussion of the common good, and he's got almost the exact formulation that's in the council documents. But interestingly, that he's not the source of it. There's a footnote there to an earlier Jesuit moral thinker, a man named Victor Catherine, who I'll come back to in just a minute. But there's also another, at the time, kind of well-known Jesuit economic thinker, a French thinker named Charles Antoine, who lived from 1848 to 1921. And he published a book called Cours d'économie sociale, Course on Social Economy, that I discovered it went through, I don't know, something like 15 editions. I mean, it was, in fact, nobody reads it now, but it was a very influential treatise on economics from a Catholic standpoint in the late 19th, early 20th century. And he has that same formulation. And again, he cites Catherine. So seeing Catherine in that book by Antoine and also by Heinrich Hesch, I then went back and found Victor Catherine, and he wrote a number of textbooks on moral thinking that were used in seminaries, and almost the precise formulation that's in Matra et Magistra and in Gaudium Spes is in Catherine's textbooks. One of them is in Latin, the other one is in German. And he really is the source. He lived from 1845 to 1931. He was a Jesuit moral philosopher, moral theologian, and he was part of a community, a Jesuit community in Bavaria, the Jesuit community at Maria Laach. That was originally a Benedictine foundation, but the Jesuits came into it and ran it in the 19th century, and social teaching was a big occupation there. They actually published a periodical called Stimmen aus Maria Laach, Voices from Maria Laach. Eventually, the name of it was changed to Stimmen der Zeit. Later on, it became very well-known Jesuit publication in Germany. I think it's still published. At any rate, he had a teacher, Theodor Meyer, and if you look at Meyer's work, you can find not the exact formulation, but parts of it. And Meyer was himself influenced by one of the really most important figures in the development of the modern Catholic social teaching tradition, the Italian Jesuit Luigi Tapparelli d'Azeglio, who was the rector of the Collegio Romana, the Jesuit seminary in Rome, which is now the Gregorian University, when Leo XIII was a seminarian in the 1820s. Gioacchino Vincenzo Pecci, as he was known before he was Leo XIII. Tapparelli was the rector at that seminary, and he was one of the really moving forces in the Thomistic revival in Italy at that time. He gave a series of lectures on natural law in Palermo that was published in the 1840s, and very influential on Leo XIII, on Pius XI, on lots of other theologians, especially his brother Jesuits. And so these German Jesuits at Maria Laach were working off of that and developing work on social teaching. it's very important that they were doing this work in the middle and late 19th century. So when Taparelli's lectures were in the 1840s, this community was going in the mid-19th century till the end. That Benedictine community actually had to close down during the Kulturkampf in 1870, and those Jesuits had to leave. Some of them went to England, some of them went to other places. So they were living there very much politically in the wake of the French Revolution and the revolutions of 1848, the Kulturkampf in Germany, and the Risorgimento in Italy, which, of course, in 1870, when modern Italy came into being, that was also the abolition of the Papal States. And so what you've got happening here is that the modern state, the modern secular state, is really causing a lot of trouble for the church. And these Jesuit social thinkers were grappling with that. And they're writing a lot of things about it. They're also early critics of Marxism. Catherine wrote a whole book on Marxism, very critical of that. They're worried that the modern state is too powerful, oppressive to people, especially to the church, a threat to human persons in many cases. They want to limit it. They want to use the Thomistic notion of the common good as a way to limit the modern state. So they developed this notion of it as part of that project. And it's important to think about the nature of the modern state. Again, the idea of the common good as we have it historically in Aristotle, right? It's coming out of the context of the classical city that I talked about a few minutes ago, developed by medieval theologians in a very different political context, but also very different from what we have. If you think about the modern states, there are four aspects of it that I think are particularly important. And, you can see this in the greatest thinkers of the modern state. I think Hobbes in Leviathan, for example, 1651, and then Max Weber, the great German sociologist in the late 19th and early 20th century. But sort of four aspects of the modern state that I think are very important. One, it's bureaucratic, rational organization. Bureaucratic, rational, legal form of organization. Secondly, it's being empowered in doing what it does by modern science and technology. Modern science and technology created possibilities for the state to act on people in ways that didn't exist before. I think that's very important for these 19th century Jesuit thinkers. They're still writing, as well as others, when you get into the 1930s and 40s, and concerned about totalitarianism. Totalitarianism was not possible until modern times because it needed the technology that was only available later on for the state to be totalitarian. Also, the modern state is based on a notion of political legitimacy that flows completely from the will of the people. In traditional Catholic political thought, ultimately the legitimacy of political authority comes from God, and it's mediated by the political community. But the modern state is really predicated on a notion that the authority comes simply from human will. And finally, the modern state is built on a separation of the state as a kind of bureaucratic juridical body from society, from civil society, a distinction between that, which didn't really exist in the ancient world and to a much lesser extent in the Middle Ages. Now, this formulation that comes out of this awareness of the modern state, I think, really, and the various characteristics of it, makes its way into the magisterium. I think I figured out in a fairly interesting way. These Jesuit thinkers' ideas got into textbooks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Catharine's moral theology textbook, especially, but other textbooks as well. And from there, they make their way through, I think, the work of advisors into statements of the magisterium. That happens first, not in encyclicals, but in speeches. So you can find formulations of the common good very similar to this in speeches given by Pius XII. And Pius XII's main advisor on matters of social teaching was a Jesuit theologian, social thinker named Gustav Gundlach. And Gundlach was steeped in all of this Jesuit thinking. In fact, Gundlach took over the institute that was originally created for Heinrich Pesch. And he was an advisor to Pius XII, wrote speeches for Pius XII. In fact, in some cases, he wrote speeches for Pius XII, and then when the Pope gave the speech on the radio, Gundlach would publish an article somewhere where he would interpret it. And he was in a very good position to interpret it because he'd written it. And so he was also an advisor very early on to John the 23rd, although he died very soon after John became Pope. So I don't know how influential he was, but he certainly did have a hand in the first draft of Moderate Magister, the first draft. It was redrafted after that, but Gundlach was certainly involved in the first draft. So Gundlach, I think, really was the guy through whom this Jesuit social thinking made it into the papal magisterium. And it makes an appearance in an encyclical letter, kind of the highest level of papal teaching, with John the 23rd's 1961 encyclical Moderate Magistra. But he's really getting it from Pius XII. He's really getting it from Pius XII, who, of course, is very concerned with totalitarianism, with the threats to the church and the threats to the human person posed by the modern secular state, empowered by technology, largely secular, thought to be a product simply of human will, bureaucratic, rational in its structures. Pius XII is also influenced by philosophical personalism, interestingly. He's interpreted as a personalist by various people, and that plays into this as well, I think, in some ways. And then the reason that formulation is in Gaudium et Spes in the council documents, I think, is first and foremost because it was in John the 23rd's encyclicals, which were the cutting edge at that time. If you were going to go to statements of social teaching and when the council was going on, it would naturally, you would go to John the 23rd's statements. But you can find other textbooks that were written in the 1950s before Gaudium et Spes, even before Moderate Magister, where you can find this formulation. There's one that I found that was published in French for the French bishops on social teaching, and it includes this formulation. And the footnotes are to speeches by Pius XII. So when it was incorporated into the council documents in 1965, the fact is it was already something of a commonplace, which you would find in textbooks mostly created during Pius XII's pontificate, but based on the thinking of these Jesuit moral thinkers that goes back into the 19th century and is really a reaction to the political events that began with the French Revolution and then followed that through the revolutions of 1848, the Kulturkampf, the Risorgimento, and on into the rise of totalitarianism in the early mid-20th century. So I'll end my presentation with that.
Professor Lewis, thank you so much. That's fascinating, especially how you trace the 100-year history of this, of the development of this formulation that's so common to us now from Vatican II, repeated in the Catechism, repeated in the Compendium of the Church's social teaching, repeated by modern pontiffs, including Pope Francis. So to get a sense of where the term comes from, but also, as you say, a sense of its controversy too, just in terms of how it appears to be people to be open to various kinds of interpretation. Before we open to questions from those participating, and again, anyone who would like to ask a question, please write it in the Q&A chat that's included in the Zoom frame here. If I might just ask a couple of questions, as you've studied the development of the history, or the history of the development of the term, and if it's true, as you claim, that it's really a translation of Thomistic, classical and medieval Aristotelian Thomistic content regarding the common good into modern parlance, of modern language. What's your sense of how the modern language or the modern description captures that content, and if there's anything that you think it leaves behind, what would you say there? So, in a sense, what does the modern formulation get right in terms of translation? And of course, every translation is also a kind of treachery too, right? So, what does it either leave behind or betray the tradition, if anything at all?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question and an important one. So I think the first thing that has to be said is that the formulation, in one sense, assumes that traditional background. So if we say that the common good is happiness, is perfection, which ultimately means unity with God, the beatific vision, it assumes that that is the case, and that it's the life of virtue that the people of a particular political community can live with one another. It doesn't repudiate that. In some sense, it assumes it. But the question is, given the nature of the modern state, how much of that, compared to, for example, what a Greek polis, a kind of face-to-face community, very small scale, culturally, morally, far more homogenous in the 4th century BC could do, or a medieval political community could do, right? How do we apply that in the context of the modern state, which is so vast, right? The United States, 300 million people, 3,000 miles long, $20 trillion economy, right? I mean, obviously, the notion of what it is that the state itself can do is thinned out. And thinned out to the point where we say, well, we're going to focus on conditions, on those things that make it possible for people to associate with one another, to develop themselves, to develop virtues, to develop, including the theological virtues, right, through their membership in the church, right, and to limit the state in allowing all of that to happen. Right? I mean, I really think that's what's going on. And there's an attempt to speak to people outside our tradition that this is what the political community is supposed to do. It's not the be-all and the end-all. The modern state is not an end. Actually, interestingly, Pius XII actually calls the state a kind of instrument, a quasi-instrumentum in Summi Pontificatus, his encyclical that was published at the very beginning of World War II in 1939. And sometimes people say that this formulation makes the common good instrumental. I think that's not right. The common good is not instrumental, but the state is. The state is an instrument for the sake of the common good. And the common good includes these conditions on the basis of which people can achieve their flourishing, which is itself a kind of common good, but not one that the state can simply effect. That's what I would say.
No, I think that's helpful. And part of this history here too is right at the time that Pius XII is starting to introduce this language, at least in his own speeches. Someone like Charles de Koninck, Catholic philosopher up at the University of Laval, is writing certainly in defense of and promotion of the classical notion of the common good. It's kind of very thick Aristotelian Thomistic content, writing it as a way of warning kind of Catholic intelligentsia from presenting the common good just in that kind of individualistic or instrumental kind of view. Would you say that someone was, as the language of the terminology developed, was de Koninck ignored in those in terms of his warnings, or do you see that there's a way in which maybe the church, and adopting some of the more modern language, actually takes care, to heed his kind of warning to ward off excessively individualistic or any individualistic or instrumental reads of the common good?
Yeah, that's really a fascinating issue, I think. And so a couple of things. One is I find no reference, and you've studied de Koninck, even more than I have, I think. And I've never found any reference anywhere in de Konink's work to anything like that formulation. And now, again, that book comes out in 1943. So, there were speeches by Pius XII where you can find it. I don't know how many of those he would have been familiar with. And I have no idea whether he was familiar with the writings of some of these Jesuit thinkers. Maybe, maybe not. I just don't know. But I've never seen any reference to any of that in the work that he was writing. Stayed pretty close to Thomas's own text. Now, the usual story is that he was very worried, especially about the adoption of a personalist notion of the common good by Catholic thinkers, and especially Maritain. And I've often heard people say that they think the formulation in the council documents is actually the origin of that is Maritain. And that's not true either. It's not Maritain. And Maritain doesn't mention much of this either. He's kind of got his own view that he worked up. I think the most important thing is that for de Koninck, the main worry was that the common good itself would be seen as instrumental. And I don't think the formulation in the social teaching documents has that. I think it's careful not to say that. But the state is another matter. And of course, de Koninck has things to say about the modern state. He's very worried about it. He identifies it with the thinking of Hobbes. Of course, he was a real student of Marxism, so he knew all about totalitarianism, and he himself was very worried about that. So he too wanted his own understanding of the common good, which was much more, had a larger speculative element to oppose that kind of thinking. And also the other notion he was really concerned about was the idea that individual human beings are their own ends. I mean, really, the personalism that he wanted to condemn amounted to that notion, that individual human persons are their own ends. And obviously that the social teaching formulation is not connected to that at all. As I said, and I think is true, it has to be read in the context of everything else. It assumes, right, that the truth that ultimately the common good of the whole cosmos is God, and that's the final end of every individual human being. But it's constructed in such a way as to recognize that in modern states, there are people who don't believe that. And you want to prevent a notion of the state, use of the state, and perhaps the notion of the common good that's very strongly committed to one of those alternative theories that could be very problematic for human beings and for the church. Like, for example, imagine, a sort of full-blown theory of the common good adopted and prosecuted by state power that comes from utilitarianism. That would be highly problematic. And so I think they really wanted to construct a notion that they thought could be agreed to by a lot of other people and would prevent a lot of these bad things from happening, but that was also consistent with the church's own.
Yeah, so with that said, just maybe one last question, then we'll turn to the questions of our viewers. If you were charged by Pope Francis tomorrow to, come up with a description of the common good that from here on out would be, repeated in ecclesial and papal statements, would it more or less be what it is that we've inherited from John the 23rd? Would you seek kind of a full rewrite, or is there a word or phrase in the current formulation that you would just like to see tweaked? Just a kind of a little thought exercise there.
Yeah, that's interesting. My formulation would need to be about 350 pages long. It would, I think if I were to do anything, and actually John Paul II did this to some degree. I mean, in Centesimus Annus, he's got kind of a very nice discussion of the common good, where I think he's concerned. I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect he was worried that people were using that formulation that's in the council documents badly, and it was being taken out of context, perhaps, and used in ways that were problematic. And so I think his discussion of it there, where he explicitly says it's not some total of utilities or personal goods, it has to be understood in the right context and so forth. I think he was very concerned to reiterate that, but he didn't want to change the formulation necessarily. It was mostly a matter of context. And I think that's what I would want to do too, is make it very clear that formulation, it's not enough. It's sort of necessary, but not sufficient. I would want to emphasize more about the whole package, more about the larger context, as a description of how the modern state, which is not going anywhere, operates, and as a way of disciplining the modern state, preventing it from overstepping its boundaries. Yeah, I think it's good for that. I think it's important for that. The context needs to be more clearly spelled out. That's what I would do.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. So let's turn to some questions from our viewers. One that I see here is: does the view of the common good in modern Catholic social thought include the spiritual? So I guess the thought of the uh, the the viewer here maybe, because obviously in a lot of contexts it's talking about the political common good, but writ large, does the modern Catholic thought regarding the common good include the spiritual, such as the salvation of the soul, the truth that God must be the foundation of political authority?
I think understood in a kind of higher sense, it absolutely does. Right. So again, that formulation about conditions is clearly, I mean, all those documents, it's in sections that deal with the political community. Right, it's the temporal common good. But there's also, as I said, also at a higher level, God is the common good. And in the Catechism, if you look up every reference to common good in the Catechism, which I did do, believe it or not, there are a number of places where it refers to the common good of the church. And in some cases, that common good of the church refers to its internal order and organization, but in other places, it refers to God as the common good of the church as well. And God is the common good of everything, the whole cosmos, ultimately. So absolutely. I mean, the common good for human beings is that. Does the political common good include that spirituality? In this respect, it does. It has to include the protection of fundamental human rights. That's in the Catechism, in the section that immediately follows that formulation, which is section 1906. I think 1907 says, in terms of contents, it then goes on, several of the articles specify the content in kind of 3 stages. So protection of human dignity through fundamental human rights, and then it says the basic security for the political community, and then finally sort of its internal development. But that protection for basic human rights, the most important one of those is, of course, the right to religious freedom. And that right to religious freedom is predominantly important because that's the right that most has to do with the way human beings face their destiny as human persons ordered to the common good that is God. And the state doesn't and shouldn't dictate that for a lot of different reasons. But the guarantee and protection of religious freedom is a way of making sure that the spiritual life is part of the particular common good of that community.
Another question we received: have you found any connection between the development of this conception of the common good and the concept of subsidiarity? Was subsidiarity explicitly included in some of the concepts discussion, and I presume they're in its development?
Yeah, I think it certainly is. So the notion of subsidiarity has its philosophical origin, ultimately in Aquinas and Aristotle, but as subsidiarity, as that notion defined as such, the place where it originates is in the thought of this Jesuit philosopher that I mentioned, Luigi Tapparelli. He's the one who really develops this in this treatise on natural law that's published in the 1840s. He preferred his neologisms to be Greek rather than Latin or Italian, so he called it the hypotactic law. The phrase he used was hypotaxis. Now, literally translated, into Latin, sub deo means the same thing, and it referred to 2 different possibilities. Hypotaxis was a term that was used in grammar, Greek grammar, that had to do with the relationship of words to one another. But it also, in Latin, was used to describe the formation of Roman legions, where the sort of auxiliary troops would sit beneath or behind the Roman troops. And so subsideo indicated that too. But the whole idea there was that the political community exists in order to promote and protect the agency of individual persons and groups below the level of the political community. And so when Tapparelli develops that notion in his treatise on natural law, he's very concerned with the course of nationalism and the formation of nation states in Europe in the mid-19th century. And he wants to make sure that they're not too powerful, that they don't wind up oppressing local communities, families, the church, right? Because the agency of those groups carrying out their own actions, developing themselves internally, is itself a good. And so what the state should do at the highest level is protect that good and help them, not take it all over and do it itself. So that's absolutely a part of the common good. And the elements of that notion of the common good, that it has to do with conditions, that those conditions are conditions that aim at human perfection of individuals and groups, all the elements of that are put together in that phrase in Gaudium et Spes, but originally John's phrase, and then a phrase that you can find in Catherine, those elements are all in Taparelli. He just didn't put them together the way that Catherine did, but I'm pretty sure he got them from his teacher, and his teacher got them from Taparelli. And so there's a very close connection between subsidiarity and that notion of the common good, I think.
Another question here is, how would you assess this Catholic formulation of the common good in light of contemporary discussions just regarding the Catholic stance towards the modern state? So, I mean, does the classical view of the common good, even translated in kind of more modern parlance, have something to say, positive or negatively, in regard to the modern state? Is the modern state something that the Catholics should be there cheerleading for because of their defense of the common good, or is there another view or another kind of relationship that's implied there?
Yeah. So this is a vexed question. It's an important question, but it's a vexed question in this sense, right? The modern state is, I mean, the fact of its self-understanding as simply a product of human will, the fact of its refined efficiency of organization, of its secular character, and of its ability to act on the basis of modern science and technology makes it very dangerous. And it's done very bad things in the 20th century and following. Alexander the Great could have never imagined the power he might have had if he lived in the 1950s instead of, in late antiquity. But if you look around the world, right, what's the alternative? Right? I mean, in a certain respect, as bad as the modern state can be, the only thing worse is to have no state at all. Right? I mean, what's the alternative to the modern state is not the medieval village. It's not the Greek polis. It's Somalia. It's of Lebanon at certain times. It's what we sometimes call failed states, or places in the world where you've got anarchy and violence. So I think in the context that we live in, I certainly want to live in a state. I don't want to live where there isn't one. But I want it to be limited. I want people to understand, to use the terms that Maritain used, actually, I think, in Man and the State quite recently, that the state is for man, man is not for the state. And that the temporal common good, such as the state needs to promote, must be subordinate to the transcendent common good. It shouldn't pretend to be more than it is. That's when you really get terrible problems. So I once heard Alistair McIntyre say, who's very critical of the modern state, more than I am, say, yeah, it's got all these problems, it's terrible and so forth. At the same time, it's like the weather, and it's not going anywhere. So the point is to control it, to limit it in the right way, so that it's more helpful than hurtful. And I think Catholic social teaching, were it widely accepted and used as a guide for our politics, would do precisely that.
Oh, thank you. So I like this question here because it's something I've reflected on a lot too. So you are right. There's a certain sort of importance that the common good is often seen to have over the good of individuals. They talk about the individual good there. But what about the common good? What about it, as you've described it, explains that priority? Since the viewer writes, I'm assuming that it does not just come down to a utilitarian thought that the aggregate collective is larger than the individual. Therefore, the common good, because it's bigger in various ways, is simply better.
Yeah, the issue is not that it's bigger. The issue is that it can do things, right? Because of all of the energies that go into it, provided by all of the persons who make up the community, that we need to pursue our own flourishing. It makes it a funny kind of end, right? I mean, in a certain respect, we have to be for the common good, because if we're not, how's it going to be maintained, right? And how's its importance going to be recognized that we need in order to pursue our own flourishing and perfection? On the other hand, it's for our flourishing, right? If there were no people, there wouldn't be any common good of that kind, any temporal common good. I mean, there would always be God, and God would be the transcendent common good, but there wouldn't be any temporal common good if there weren't any people. So it's both the case that the common good is for us, but that it won't work for us. It won't be a part of our own good unless we're for it. In that respect, I think the common good has to be understood in the way that Aristotle describes, and Aquinas following him, friendship. For example, in the Nicomachean Ethics, right? Friendship is a good in the sense that it's something that's desirable for me. It helps me to flourish and to perfect my life. It's good for me. That good's not available to me unless I really care for my friend as his or her own good, unless I'm for them. Unless I love that person, I don't get the benefit. So there's a constant, kind of circularity to that relationship. I'm for the friend and the relationship is for me. And if it breaks at any point, it's lost. And I think the temporal common good is a bit like that. I mean, those things that go concretely to make it up. And of course, if you sort of think about the temporal common good, right, you can give a description of the things that make it up. Some of them are very strictly useful things like roads and, communications systems and transportation systems and the rest of it. But there are other elements of it too that are very important, so that there's a kind of civic friendship, a kind of identity. Often it's national identity, but sometimes it's other kinds of identity among the persons who make up the community. And those all make it work as a set of conditions that allow me and allow my family and allow my parish, my local community to pursue their own kinds of perfection. And I have to do things. Sometimes it involves sacrifice for that. But if I don't do those things, it doesn't provide those things for me. I mean, yeah.
This is, I think, a point in the conversation or the discussion of the common good in general where DeConnick is really helpful, because I think through his, on the one hand, kind of metaphysical investigation, description of the good, and kind of metaphysically describe what the common good is, and that because of the various ways in which various goods can diffuse themselves as an actual hierarchy, he talks about how they are related to each other. The good of the family, the good of the city, church, cosmos, God. How because of their the hierarchy, they aren't opposed to each other, but oriented, one to another. So I think on the one hand, just approaching the question there is very good. And that's where you can then understand how it is that the common good is a good of the individual. It's not the only good. It's a higher and better good, but specifically a good of the individual, not in distinction from, but not in opposition to the particular good of the individual. And so, I mean, that was a particular a special concern of DeConnick to get that part right, because he thought that's certainly one of the sources of error that he saw in that kind of personalist presentation he was opposing there. But that's a fascinating part of the discussion. And I think John Paul II picks that up even in his philosophical papers before his election. He's trying to arrive at Thomistic conclusions beginning at the kind of Thomistic objective conclusions beginning at personalist subjective experience, And I think one of the ways in which he wants to do that is to show how the I thou discussion, which might, help to highlight something like friendship, can't end there. That's not the end of that kind of description of that relationship, that the I, the thou results in a we. And when you turn about the we and the good of the we, in John Paul's language, then you get the real sense that what is mine, or what is ours, is mine in a particular way, and in a better way than which just mine particularly, as an I. But what is ours as a we, is presents another lens through which to kind of understand that the real kind of mystery of the good here that's involved.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there's a very interesting part of Aristotle in the Politics, where he's talking about the nature of the city at one point, and he distinguishes between what he calls a true city and a city in name only, which he says is more like an alliance than a city. And the model of the alliance, or what some of the sophists thought of as a kind of primitive social contract theory, that it was just a kind of instrumental good that people agree to individually so that it protects them, limited to kind of personal protection and this sort of thing. And he said, nah, that's not a real city. A real city has got offices in common, and it has laws, and there's a kind of friendship between the people who make it up. And so sometimes you read that and you think, well, what is the modern state? I mean, is it simply, doesn't look like Aristotle's true city. So does that mean it's simply the alliance, right? The thing that's created by a social contract, like, Lycophron the sophist or somebody thought. And I think the answer to that is no. I think it's in between, because unless there is some kind of sense of civic identity, of civic friendship, even within the context of modern state, obviously it's going to be thinner. It's not going to be the same as in a very small community. But unless there's something like that, and I think it's very hard to think of it in terms of a common good, then I think you can find plenty of places, even in our own country, our society, where you do see that. Like with patriotism, where people's willing sacrifice for people they don't know who live, in California or some other place that's far away, but still, part of our country and still connected to us in some way. Yeah.
Maybe two more questions, and maybe we can take these somewhat briefly. But I think you hit on this before, but this may give you an opportunity to expand on your earlier thoughts. What are some of the practical implications of this definition of the common good on public policies of the modern state? And the writer of the question continues, I think we can understand this definition better if we know when it results in different policies as compared to alternative formulations of the common good. So maybe the question is like, what's the cash value in our modern politics of this notion of common good, or description of the common good?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm going to have a very disappointing answer to it. I think the most important thing about it is that it provides a kind of practical examination of conscience that we have to use when thinking about public policy, rather than yielding very specific, this is what results from the common good, right? We have all kinds of things that we disagree about politically, right? What should the marginal tax rates be? What kind of business regulations should we have? Thinking about our security policy, do we build submarines or aircraft carriers? I mean, these are very practical things. Does this formulation of the common good sort of you can run this and you get the answer to those questions? No. But it keeps us thinking straight, right? And, a lot of our political discussion is precisely, of our political disagreement, is disagreement precisely about the common good, right? What conditions are required for people to achieve their fulfillment, persons and groups in our society, right? And that's the way that we should be arguing about these things, right? I mean, if you've got one view about tax policy versus another, or regulation, or what kind of policies support families, tariffs, international trade, globalization, all that kind of thing, right? Are these policies that maintain the conditions that really do promote the flourishing of the citizens of this community? People are going to disagree about that. There's no question about it. But if they're disagreeing about that, then they're disagreeing about the right thing, you know? So I think the value of it is never going to come because it operates as a kind of machine or algorithm or something like that. The concrete realization of the common good is always going to be practical and local. If you want to talk about the transcendent common good, that's God and unity with God, you can talk about that very precisely. But if you're talking about the temporal common good, it's going to be very vague unless you're talking about the temporal common good of this particular community. And then you've got to hash out all the details of public policy and so forth. And it's going to be different from one country to another, just as the way that each individual person pursues the good in his own life is going to look different, right? I mean, there's not one kind of life plan that everybody's going to adopt and results in happiness. Everybody's looks a little different, even though they're aiming at something that's the same ultimately, right? And I think that's always going to be true about the particular common good of a particular community.
Maybe last question here. We can wrap up with this. One of the viewers writes, I'm struck by Pope Francis's use of common home in the subtitle of Laudato Si. Do you have any thoughts about the relationship between the common good, as described elsewhere in the Magisterium, and Pope Francis's discussion in the language of our common home?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way. I think when Francis is using that phrase, he really does in some ways have in mind kind of the planet. I think more than particular political community. So he's thinking about, the home of humanity, right? Of our species, right? In a way. And so it's certainly that is connected to the common good. I mean, and it's even connected to and maybe this is a great way to end, right? Here we are. It's the Institute for Human Ecology, and I think that name was chosen in part because it's a phrase John Paul II used. He talked about human ecology. I think Francis has repeated it though, and that term ecology ultimately comes from the same root as economics, but that Greek term is oikos. It comes from the term for home or household, and oikos is a household. Oikonomia is the kind of law of the household, the study of the household. Ecology has to do with kind of reasoning about the way in which human beings are at home in the world, and not, because we're not ever completely at home in the world, right? I mean, that can't be. So certainly those qualities that Francis is concerned about, which have to do with the world in a larger sense, are a part of that ecology, which is another way of talking about the common good, and one that's quite important, and not just in a sense of natural economy, but even human ecology includes moral ecology as well, I think. Yeah.
What, as a kind of second part of this question, the same viewer writes, and it does piggyback off of things you just mentioned. As fellow occupants of that home, then, so not thinking in terms of the human political culture, but let's say our common home on this planet, which is occupied by other kinds of beings besides human beings. What is the place of non-human beings then as being part of the social groups and their individual members? Is there room in the catechism's description of the common good for that kind of consideration?
I haven't thought about that deeply, but I think it's very interesting. And here I'm, again, Francis, one should be serious about the Franciscan element of that, right? I mean, all of creation, think about Bonaventure, are signs that point to aspects of God, creation itself. Tells us about God. I mean, all the creatures referred to him and reveals something about God's perfection. So they absolutely play a role in reminding us of what our true home is and what we should be guided by.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. And I do think that, again, with Draconic Alive and writing today, I think there's a lot Laudato Si that he would like, because I think it does highlight above the domestic common good, above the political common good, kind of the cosmic quality of the common good in terms of all creation in the microcosm that is our planet. It does, point to the kind of the cosmic reality in which Aquinas likes to talk about in terms of what was God thinking about when he made me, the cosmos, the whole, Aquinas has that sense. And where I fit into, the whole, as a human being. So I do that. I think Laudato Si in its own way, tees up that kind of consideration, that does fit into the larger, tradition regarding the common good, that helps us to expand the conversation beyond just the domestic or the political common good, or helping to see those human societies within a wider consideration of the common good, and how they're all those instances of the common good are analogically, related to each other. So, well, Professor Lewis, thank you so much for sharing with us the fruits of your research. We look forward to the book that's coming out, that's going to include this and other chapters, the fruits of your research and study of the common good. Certainly want to thank everyone for tuning in this afternoon, all of our viewers. And IHE would certainly invite you to stay tuned, to keep watching your emails and on the website for other webinars and other presentations of the Institute, and maybe just to call your attention to one coming up on November 13th, Feminism Against Progress, number 2. This is apparently the second instance of this program, a post-feminism. So more information will be coming on that soon, online in your inboxes. So stay tuned for that. Again, Professor Lewis, thank you, and thanks to you for sponsoring our event this afternoon, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. God bless and enjoy the rest of the day.